Hello everybody, welcome to Alan History Nerd, and in this video I'm going to explain the key ideas and the principles of the Democratic and Republican parties, and I'm doing this just as we head towards the 2020 presidential election. So this is a really important time in this, and I'm going to try and talk about the ideas of the parties traditionally, historically, and then also link it to the stuff that the two presidential candidates are saying at the moment, and particularly in the case of Trump, they're not always completely typical of their party, and both parties are also quite broad churches, and so there's quite a lot of variety in there. So a lot of stuff I'm going to say is representative of the parties, but it's not necessarily the case something that every single Democrat and every single Republican would agree with. So we're looking at the A-level specification, and we're looking at 5.2, the key ideas and principles of the Democratic and Republican parties. We'll talk at other point at the distribution of power and the changing significance of the parties, but in particular what I want to focus on is the bit on terms of the policy. So Democrats are progressive attitude on social moral issues, including crime, greater government intervention in the national economy, government provision of social welfare, and Republicans' conservatives attitude on social moral issues, more restrictive government intervention in national economy whilst protecting American trade and jobs, and particularly the second part of that is very much Trump's republicanism rather than necessarily the original republicanism idea on this, an acceptance of social welfare but a preference for personal responsibility. So the parties are fundamentally different, and it's quite hard to kind of think of it in UK terms. I mean, there isn't really a left and a right in America compared to what we would be used to in the UK or Europe. Again, it's a very rough guide. People would traditionally think of the Democrats being closer to our Labour Party and Republicans being closer to our Conservative Party, but the whole political spectrum is on a slightly different scale to the UK, and so therefore there are things that our Conservative Party would say which would be seen as kind of radical socialist fringe of the Democrats. So it's not quite the same. So the history of the Democrats is really interesting, but looking back through American history when it comes to political parties can cause a degree of confusion. So the Democrat Party had been around for a very, very long time. They were back in the second party system when they competed against the Whigs, and then we saw the Whigs collapse and saw the emergence of the Republicans that they've been competing with since the 1850s. In the 1850s and 1860s, well, the Democrats were the party of slavery. They were the party of the South in the American Civil War. And in the post-Civil War era, they were the party that opposed Reconstruction and was the party of segregation as they regained control of the South following the withdrawal of federal troops. They traditionally were the party of the poor, and I've added in brackets whites. They were the party of the poor white population. They received notable support, for example, and continue to follow to receive notable support from immigrant groups such as the Irish community in New York, and that would go all the way back to this period in history back in the 19th century. Things started to change in the 20th century under Roosevelt, FDR. In the 1930s, they became the party of the New Deal and greater government intervention. And then the party of civil rights under JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson in the 1960s. And Johnson continued the idea, kind of social intervention, the idea of great society and the growth of the state and social welfare as well. And in more modern times, they continue the party of kind of more progressive and liberal social policies, the party that favours greater government intervention in the economy and other aspects of American people's lives, and in particular strengthening the power of federal government. And they are increasingly seen as the party that supports minority rights. So they are really often seen as the party of the ethnic minorities of America, of the more recent immigrant populations of America, and they are the ones that are seen to uphold or promote kind of greater racial equality. Notably, Obama, the first African American president, was a Democrat. Now, obviously, there's a very confusing history in there, but the Democrats have been around for a very long time and have fundamentally changed on a lot of issues through time. The Republicans, well, the Republicans were initially were a northern party. They came into existence in 1854 in a reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, largely. They opposed, first of all, the growth of slavery, and then under the first ever Republican president, who was Abraham Lincoln, they abolished slavery following the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865. In the post-war era, the post-Civil War era, in the 1860s, 1870s, they pushed an idea of reconstruction of the South and fought for black rights in the South, and responsible for the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment that gave equal citizenship, and the 15th Amendment which guaranteed the vote for the former slave population in the South, or at least tried to. And back then they championed federal power over states' rights. The Democrats at this point in time were the party of states' rights. Again, that changes over time. I mean, some things have remained. They are traditionally the party of business and industry in favour of free market economics. They became increasingly the party of the South, particularly the white population in the South, as the Democrats embraced civil rights movement, and the Republican Party was very strongly influenced by the ideas of the New Right, particularly with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And has become, in particular, the home of the Christian right, also referred to in America as evangelicals. And this group have meant that there's this strong kind of belief in kind of Christian morality, which tends to be really quite socially conservative. Trump's republicanism seems to have a kind of roots in another party from the 1850s, which were called the Know Nothings. I'm not making that up; that's what they were called. It was because it was started off as a kind of a secret organisation. And if you remember asked, do you know anything about it? You say I know nothing. And they ran in elections, often referred to as the American Party. And they were an anti-immigration nativist party, and they later the Know Nothings later kind of joined in with the Republicans as the Know Nothings kind of fell to one side as a political force, and the Republicans raised up, and we see that kind of patriotic nativism in Republican ideology. And again, we see this idea under Trump of trying to protect American jobs and American industry and making America great again and all that. And that has a lot of roots in the nativist ideas of the Know Nothings going back to the 1850s. And that has remained a trend within the Republican Party, but they're not completely fitting with all the free market economics that we see, for example, with Reagan in the 1980s, though Trump does often praise the Reagan administration. Now, both parties are very broad churches, and what that means is that a whole range of views exists within them. So it might well that you are an avid follower or supporter of one of these two groups, and I'll say something, and you go, I don't believe that. That's not true. Now, and there is some generalization in this. Not all Republicans believe all the same things. Not all Democrats believe all the same things. National parties, as such, are far looser kind of collections of people than they are in the UK. Generally speaking, Democrats are more socially liberal and progressive, whilst Republicans are more socially conservative, with a strong emphasis on Christian values. But they are often very economically liberal, where they want small state and small government and little interference in the economy. There are really notable regional variations. So a Democrat in the South is going to be different to a Democrat in the Northeast. A Republican in California is going to be different to a Republican in South Carolina. So there is that regional variation, which adds a degree of interest, but also a degree of difficulty. Increasingly in America, we are seeing partisanship, where we're seeing the tribes of the Democrat and Republicans getting further and further apart, and increasingly opposed to each other, and not just in mild disagreement, but really kind of disliking the other side, not universally, but there is more of a trend towards that in America, and therefore the divide is more easy to see at this point in time than it has been at points in the past. some key areas of difference. I'm going to go through a whole range of these. I'm going to start with probably one of the most fundamental and important ones. Is their differences over the Constitution. So the Democrats at the moment tend to be more in favour of federal power, things being controlled by the federal government, while the Republicans tend to be for more state power. And states taking more responsibility over things, and shrinking of the federal state, making the federal state smaller. Obviously, very difficult to do in current circumstances. In terms of interpretation of the Constitution, the more progressive pro-democrat views on the Constitution seem to be to interpret it in a ways that make it suitable to the modern world. So recognising it as a document of over 200 years, that's over 200 years old, and therefore you have to interpret it in a new way to make it fit with the world around it. Whilst the Republicans look at a more kind of literal interpretation of the Constitution and trying to take it almost exactly as the Founding Fathers meant it. And the big thing that we've seen on the Constitution and linking to the Supreme Court at the moment has been the Democrats really strongly opposing the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett, who is we believe going to be a very, very conservative Supreme Court judge, and the Republicans who have been pushing and achieving the appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. And it's believed that this will change the view of the Constitution in ways the Constitution might be looked at in terms of things like Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and also on issues such as gun control and a really big issue in America, which is abortion. In terms of guns, then the Democrats see the need for gun reform. Biden calls for the banning of assault weapons such as assault rifles, calling for universal background checks, making it easier to make gun sellers and gun manufacturers accountable for what happens with their weapons. So we are seeing a movement towards, or a call for greater gun control by the Democrats, whilst the Republicans stand very strongly behind the Second Amendment and oppose gun reform, and the NRA stands very strongly behind the Republican Party. Now, another area of difference is the economy. Now, the Democrats see the federal government as playing a role in the economy. They oppose significant tax cuts, which are often promoted by the Republicans. The Republicans call for cuts in federal taxes and also cuts in federal spending. And Biden, for example, has proposed a tax increase for those earning over £400,000. He wants us to spend more on welfare, notably the Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare as is often referred to as. And he also wants to make a significant rise in the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15. And also something, and this goes back to 2016, something known as the Buffett rule, where millionaires are not able to pay a smaller proportion of their income in taxes than your typical middle-class family. You might think that, again, Trump might not be hugely keen on that one, but judging on stuff that we've seen about his tax returns. So the Republicans, they call for reduction in federal tax, reduction in federal spending. They massively opposed Obamacare, and they accuse it as being essentially socialism rather than progressive liberalism. Trump's economic policy is built on the pledge to create jobs and protect American industry from foreign competition through tariffs, hence his kind of Make America Great Again idea. It doesn't necessarily fully fit with some of the traditional free market values of republicanism, and we are seeing some what we often refer to as libertarians who are kind of splitting at various points from the Republican parties. They don't see this going down the route that they would have envisaged if they were supporters of the New Right, supporters of Reagan, because this is government intervention. It's not, and we see some things like subsidy and stuff like that Trump's promoting, which is not necessarily the traditional view of the Republican Party, but the Republican Party is traditionally the party of business and industry and those who control industry, and therefore a kind of a close working between a Republican government and and policies to kind of help American industry and American businesses. It would fit in terms of their ideological standpoint. Now, one thing that we see a lot on in American politics, which maybe less of a focus on in UK politics, is some of the ideas in terms of social issues. So the Democrats support the woman's right to choose in terms of abortion, whilst the Republicans and large streams of the Republican Party are very much what's referred to as pro-life, and this is called for the removal of federal funding for abortions and groups like Planned Parenthood. And there are lines of argument that come out of radical side of the Republican Party which talk about kind of life beginning at conception, and there have been moves, for example, in some Republican-controlled southern states to really push the old Wade Roe Supreme Court judgment from the 1970s in terms of abortion and really curtail the circumstances in which abortion can take place, and this would be something that would be pushed back very strongly by the Democrats. So not an issue that's often in the UK seen as a big political issue, but it is a massive political issue in America. The bit again which can be quite confusing looking at it from the UK in terms of the way around that's just been is that the Democrats oppose the death penalty whilst the Republicans support it. So that can be a little confusing. So they're pro-life but pro-death. The Republicans in terms of this, and again they will talk about being the different circumstances in terms of the instance of an unborn child versus a convicted criminal. But again, so a strongly kind of more liberal progressive view on the side of the Democrats in terms of opposing the death penalty, talking about cruel and unusual punishment and that it shouldn't be allowed, whilst we've got strong support for the death penalty on the Republican side. The Democrats are seen as the party that are pro-LGBTQ plus rights, for example, championing gay marriage. Whilst there are many in the Republican Party who oppose gay marriage and the expansion of these rights and focus on family values and marriage and family being central to the kind of pillars of American life. Again, I'm not sure if Trump is particularly typical of all Republicans in terms of his views on this, where he tends to maybe be a little bit more liberal on this issue than maybe an awful lot of the evangelical Christian right in America. There are other areas of social areas like education where there are differences where the Democrats see federal government playing a really important role in improving education. Whilst for a lot of Republicans, the key issue in education is whether there should be prayers in schools, and they believe that there should, whilst the Democrats tend to oppose that, and really because of the way they view the Constitution, they go, well, actually, federal government doesn't really have a role in education. This should be down to the states. That's not necessarily a universal view amongst all Republicans. We see George W. Bush, for example, massively expanded federal government role in education, and so we get variation on this. But the general speaking, anything that's kind of liberal and progressive tends to be Democrat, and anything that is far more conservative and focused on kind of traditional Christian values tends to be more Republican. So another key issue, kind of law and order, we touched on the death penalty already, and linking this very much with race, because these two things are very much entwined in America. So the Democrats are saying, well, the police and justice systems contain systematic institutional racism, and this has been evidenced in terms of the incarceration rates and the many issues that we've seen in terms of action by policemen against particularly young black men and also black women. And so what the Democrats are saying is essentially we need to get incarceration rates down. America imprisons people like basically no other country really in the Western world, and they call for a real examination in terms of the causes of crime. Now, Trump denies there is any racism in American policing or the American justice system. He and the Republican Party call for kind of tough mandatory prison sentences for anything to do with gang violence or murder or drug dealing or sexual offences, and so they want longer prison terms. I mean, Trump very much is presenting himself as the law and order candidate and playing on the fears of the American suburbs about a lawless America that he claims would happen under Biden. And Biden is saying essentially tough policing is not the only answer, though he has supported tough policing measures in the past, which has caused a bit of controversy with the left or more liberal side of the Democrat Party, and it's something that Trump has used against him in the campaign, where actually some of the policies Biden's backed in the past have led to higher incarceration rates amongst black men. So there's a lot of noise being made by Trump on this to try and make this a big issue. Again, when you're looking at it from the outside, then there seems to be kind of some fundamental issues in terms of what's going on with law and order in America. Another key area of difference traditionally is foreign policy and defence, and on this one, Trump is definitely slightly unusual in terms of traditional republicanism. So Democrats are traditionally seen as what are known as doves, that they tend to want more international consensus and want to avoid military action and war if they possibly can, and the Republicans tend to have more hawks in it, people who want a lot more defence spending and a lot more aggressive foreign policy. So Biden is talking in a kind of a typical kind of more dove Democrat way that you'd expect about repairing relations with the allies that he says Trump has done horrible damage to work with other countries to bring China to account rather than acting alone, which Trump is doing, and he would remove the tariffs that Trump has imposed on other countries, notably China. And traditionally, the Democrats would spend less on defence than the Republicans would. Now, Trump, in a slightly untraditional Republican, something's very untraditional for the Republicans, is pledging to reduce the number of US service people stationed abroad. So it seems to be, in a way, stepping away from the kind of the idea of the Republican as hawks, but he's also changed from a kind of traditional American way of doing foreign policy, where he's massively challenged a lot of America's allies, people like the EU, to do more themselves and not rely on America as much. And he has shown a complete disregard for a lot of international bodies, for example, the World Health Organization, over recent years. He's taken a particularly tough line on China, including the use of tariffs. Obviously, he blames them completely for COVID. And so he can talk very, very antagonistically about other countries, and at other points he will go to some traditional American allies, for example Israel, and will again work with them in a very positive way, whilst with other traditional allies, places like the EU, then that kind of cosy relationship that's been in the past, it has become a lot less cosy. So Trump has really shaken things up in terms of foreign policy, and it's difficult to absolutely pin down in terms of the normal kind of doves and hawks that we would talk about in American foreign policy. Another key area of difference going into the election is the economy. I mean, Biden has spoken of the climate emergency and the need to re-establish America's commitment to the Paris Agreement, which Trump is backed out of. He's spoken about the need to move away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy. This particularly his comments on the oil industry caused some real controversy during the 2020 campaign, and some people were saying it's going to cost him votes. Trump denies on climate change. As I said, he's opted out of international action, for example, the 2016 Paris Agreement. Republicans also, prior to this, prevented the ratification of the Kyoto Protocols, and they support and are supported by the oil and gas and coal industries. And so they talk about, well, we'll support whatever industry is economically viable. But yeah, if you're looking at climate denial, then you're looking at elements of the Republican Party. If you're looking for environmental action, you're looking at elements of the Democrat Party. Another key area of difference is over the whole COVID-19 crisis. The Democrats and Biden talking about wider federal action, including free tests for all and a nationwide mask mandate, which would affect anyone on federal property throughout the United States, and pushing all state governments to bring in mandatory mask wearing indoors and things like that. And they focus very much on Trump's mismanagement of the whole crisis, on the high death toll, and kind of the unfavourable comparisons between America and all other countries. Trump's done kind of the opposite. He's focused on reopening the economy, and we see this difference actually between the way Democrat-controlled states and Republican-controlled states have acted during the COVID crisis, with the Republican states have opened up and allowed a lot more economic activity a lot sooner and a lot quicker, and then had really big outbreaks. We've seen a great deal of resistance into mask wearing. Obviously, this was then shaken about a bit by Trump catching COVID himself, though of course he now, as he tells us all the time, is immune. And he focuses on progress that's been made towards a vaccination and claims the crisis is all but over. And that may well be true, or that might be a case of he said that before and it wasn't. He did originally say it was going to be over by Easter, and it wasn't. And this is playing in a really big way in the election campaign as it goes on at the moment, and I'm sure will do so after the election. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been helpful for you and given you loads of details about the Democrats and the Republicans as they now stand, and also that little bit look back into a bit of history to give a little bit of context. Obviously, with all things, this is all likely to change, and I will be watching with great interest to see what follows the upcoming American election. If this has been helpful, then please hit like. If you've got any comments about anything I've said, or you want to add anything in, then please do. And if you are doing A-level politics and you need more information, then please subscribe to my channel. And there's several playlists on A-level politics content. The A-level politics one as a whole, I am aiming to cover the entire A-level politics specification as we teach it, and then provide you with a really kind of helpful set of resources to help you as you go through the course, and to give you a whole range of stuff for things like revision for the exams at the end, and then other tests and essays and things you have going through. So to get notifications as I add more, not only on US politics but on UK politics, there's also a ton of stuff there on all the political ideas and ideologies that's all set up and on there already. And there's also, of course, I am Helen History Nerd. There is a load of other stuff on various history topics, including some American history, some Russian history, and some Tudor history, and some modern British history, and there's just a whole range of exciting stuff. So do subscribe and take a look at all of that. I'll speak to you all again soon.